Chinese communism had at the time of the Tiananmen crisis. Basically, the party was very divided, and the initiative kept shifting to the right, all during the demonstrations. So finally, there was a point where I think Jiao Zemin, the right wing, who represented the right wing of the party, had he not hesitated, he probably could have taken power. It was a very, very close call. And the party acted just at the last moment to crush that and stop a counter-revolution from taking place. But all the familiar characters from America, the Bolton-type people, the CIA, all the people, the NED, all the people who are responsible for disrupting, wrecking popular revolutions around the world, all of them were active in 1989. Americans' money bought fax machines for people in Beijing for their opposition. Fax machines were important back then, not so much now. And so there were communications between an apartment in New York City where the counter-revolutionaries had organized their center of power, and in Beijing. It was the other end for them to receive instructions. So these faxes back and forth, they were trying to coordinate anti-communist uprising, and that was really the character, I think, of the counter-revolutionary movement in Tiananmen. There's a writer named Li Feinon. He's an American professor, sharp guy, and I had a debate with him one time in San Jose. He wrote a book called China Rising, which, although it has a completely wrong line on the Tiananmen uprising, the book is about the Tiananmen uprising, I think it's the best book. Because it's so honest about the counter-revolutionary aims of the leaders of the demonstrations. These are aims that Li Feinon approved of course. So it's a really interesting book. It's an important book in some ways. But he locates, he tells you where in Beijing, what forces were involved in the counter-revolution. And I know that I'm not going to talk about that because we'll save that for other speakers today who will have more detail about that. Hong Kong. Hong Kong, at the time that Hong Kong was liberated in 1997, it's really hard to explain to Americans the significance that this had for Chinese people at the time. China had been, the Chinese people wanted to free Hong Kong ever since they lost their freedom to the British in the Opium Wars. So in China, this was an incredibly important event, the return of Hong Kong to Chinese power and freedom, the freedom of Hong Kong from British imperialism. So I remember at the time, I stayed up at night, I watched the handover, where they pulled down the British flag, imperialism, they put up the Chinese flag in Hong Kong in the official ceremony. At that time, if people can remember back, older people like me might remember back to 1997, the American press was filled with stories about, oh my God, the communists are going to come in, they're going to massacre people, we're going to ruin the economy of Hong Kong. Remember the Hong Kong millionaires all fleeing to the Bay Area and buying property here? It was like a really big deal, and none of those things really turned out to be true. But the bourgeoisie did stay in Hong Kong. They have strong ties to U.S. imperialism and still have strong ties to Britain. And they have the power that money brings you. And China is in this, has been in this transition. China granted Hong Kong this transition period before Hong Kong is fully incorporated into the People's Republic of China, subject to all the laws, regulations, and power of Chinese communism. So I can assure people that China will never, under any circumstances, allow imperialism to reoccupy Hong Kong. That just will not happen. Chinese people just will not stand for that. And just as there were important counter-revolutionaries with U.S. backing that endangered the Chinese Revolution in 1989, I think today's demonstrations, to some degree, it's the same cast of characters getting their instructions from the West who are involved in the activities right now. And you know, China has been so cautious in handling the demonstrators. There was a demonstration where people surrounded the police station yesterday, and the police instructions were to wait them out. So instead of attacking the demonstrators, arresting them, beating them, or shooting them, as we would do in the US if that happened, the police waited them out. They were on instructions. Don't attack the demonstrators. Stay in the police station. So they all stayed in the police station, looking through the windows, watching the demonstrations. Finally, people got tired and went home. And that's where we are today. Something Lenin taught us, we have to remember. I think when Lenin said, when people talk about democracy, you always have to ask the question, democracy for whom? Democracy for what class? You know? That's the question. That's something that Lenin taught us, that all Marxists must remember. So all this discussion in the bourgeois press, about the democracy in China. Democracy for whom? What state or what entity is more democratic? Is Hong Kong more democratic for workers? Or is China more democratic for workers? I think for the working class, China wins hands down. Hong Kong, the Hong Kong economy, because it is separate, it's integrated but not fully integrated with China. The Hong Kong economy has suffered in the last 20 or 30 years. At the time of the turnover of power to the Chinese government in 1997, Hong Kong was the main window that China had on the West. So that shipping, a lot of production, a lot of things made in China went through the Hong Kong ports. And so Hong Kong was the key sort of international business center for the People's Republic of China. But then Shanghai began to develop. And today, Shanghai is far more important than Hong Kong. Hong Kong is only now 7, 8, 9% of the Chinese economy. And it used to be like 50%, 49%. So things in Hong Kong have declined. Many young people in Hong Kong have left for China. If you go to Shenzhen, a lot of people are from Hong Kong. I remember I've gone through the border several times between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. And it's all Hong Kong people going in to buy stuff from China and then bring it back out and either sell it internationally or sell the electronics inside Hong Kong. So I just think it's important to remember democracy for whom, especially in the light of the recent events taking place in Hong Kong. And I'm done early.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
You said a fax machine. What was that you said?
They were using fax machines to communicate.
Let's hold off the questions.
Yeah.
Let's hold off the questions. Let the presentation be done.
Good to see for you.
Okay. Thanks.
Do you want to turn off that light?
Yeah, well, that was enough of Joshua 1. Can we turn the lights on here?
Yes.
We could do
It's
that.
kind of cave-like.
Yes, yes. It was only for that.
I know.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so
People should really move over because you're in the pathway to the back of the,
I'll make way.
Thank you very much.
I'm Richard Becker, and I'm actually speaking today for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm also with the Answer Coalition, as Gary said. You know, I remember in that extremely rainy winter of 1982 and 1983, we had a demonstration in Golden Gate Park because Reagan and Queen Elizabeth were having a banquet in the DeYoung Museum.
I was there for that.
Yeah, and you know that it was a coalition of Irish American, Chinese American, and anti-war groups that got together, and others too. And one of the main demands, of course, was China give back Hong Kong, Britain give back Hong Kong to China. That was the exact wording of it. In 1989, I was then in Workers' World Party when Tiananmen happened. And that was the most isolated I've ever been politically. Workers' World disagreed with the mainstream assessment, said it was that it was an attempted counter-revolution, I mean, at the time. And really, it's almost impossible to describe the level of hysteria against China. And I think a lot of people here remember it because of your age and my age. But it was, when we had a public event about it, it was lightly attended. It was about 3 weeks afterwards. But we did it, and we spoke out against it, and we used mainly, at the time, the mainstream media. But the mainstream media did this in a certain way, and I'll talk about it in a minute, and like the public relations firms, and I remember this from the Yugoslavia War very clearly, their slogan, like Hill and Knowlton, these big PR companies, is first impressions are everything. Whatever comes afterwards doesn't matter because the impression has been created. So we had at that time, this incredible hysteria that said that thousands, tens of thousands perhaps at the time was said, people had been mowed down by machine gun fire. The machine guns had been on top of the palace, of the Congress, and they just opened fire and the thing that you had to ask is where were the piles of bodies afterwards? But of course they didn't ask any questions like that. I think that when we talk about what happened in 1989 in Tiananmen, and it's kind of, I think, somewhat interesting also, is that Workers' World Party had a very strong position, a very critical position of China at the time, on two grounds. One, that the capitalist-style reforms, and the second was the alliance that China had really entered into in 1979 with the U.S. against the Soviet Union. But Workers' World never took the position that China was capitalist or fascist or imperialist or any of that. As a matter of fact, spoke out very strongly against that viewpoint. But it was kind of ironic that having had this very strongly critical position, Workers' World was virtually the only left organization in the United States, I think, at the time, that strongly disagreed with the mainstream. The left, and even people I knew in the left at the time who said, yeah, we're right, but it's just too much to say otherwise. The demonstrations, I think, began with the Hu Yaobang funeral in April. And at the first, they were a mixed bag. They were a very mixed bag. There was a lot of there were groups within it who were critical of that the children of the new rich and of the government were getting privilege, that there was corruption, and so forth. There were others who wanted not to be assigned to work, even though they had gone through a completely paid-for state education system. They wanted to be able to go into private enterprise and not be required to to accept assignments. There were a lot of different factions in this, but as this demonstration went on from mid-April for 7 weeks, occupying the center of the capital city, which is something we should think about how the U.S. government would react to that. We know how they would, and much in a very speedy way. But increasingly became more and more clearly a pro-Western demonstration. And the erection of the goddess of democracy, which was obviously based on the Statue of Liberty, was something that made that pretty clear. After nearly a month, martial law was declared on May 17th. But I very much agree with what David said, is that there was a huge division. There was major division inside the Chinese Communist Party leadership over what to do. Things did not move quickly. The U.S. I want to just read something. This is from an article by Brian Becker that was just republished, and people can read the article. It's I think a very important article on liberationnews.org, and it's entitled "The Massacre That Wasn't." And in the case of the Voice of America, this is in the later stage of this occupation of the square. The Voice of America increased its Chinese language broadcast to 11 hours each day and targeted the broadcast directly to about 2,000 satellite dishes in China. The satellite dishes were almost all in the hands of the military, the people who were getting this, and they began doing these broadcasts about divisions inside of the military. And that would grow to a point where in the last stage of this, they were talking about that there was fighting going on, that some PLA units were firing on others, and different units were loyal to the protesters and others to the government. The Voice of America and U.S. media outlets tried to create confusion and panic among government supporters. Just prior to June 4th, they reported that Chinese Prime Minister Li Peng had been shot and that Deng Xiaoping was near death. This is what was going on. This was part of the whole effort that really was centered in the United States. And then this is in that last stage in the role of the media. On May 31st, many of the students left the square. And the square, who was in the square, turned into something different. And it was those who were really actually including forces who were prepared for combat. And you've seen in the Chailing, the bloodhead, for the Chinese people to wake up, the square must be awash in blood. But we can't tell our supporters that because it's going to be their, of course, because it was going to be their blood. And they were supposed to know about this ahead of time. And Chailing, proclaimed herself as a video that Gerald sent around, the commander-in-chief.
Yep.
She was the commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
And openly calling for the overthrow of the government. The government must be overthrown. In fact, that's how things really change is that in the last stage, the last 2 weeks, the main demand of the people in the square, of the occupiers of the square, was the overthrow of the government. So this is a clearly counter-revolutionary demonstration. And Chailing says so herself.
I have to say something about this now, okay? Because
Can
I
we-
saw
no.
the same problem with Joshua, because I shot the Chailing interview, and her other quote was, "I love my mother, I love my father, but we also love China. Who is going to stay?" So I think from the outside, people may have gotten a lot of different kinds of information, but just like with Joshua Wong, I would think with Chailing, you guys don't have correctly what people's internal background and motivations were. So it's
This
kind
is
of
an
not
interruption.
fair to repeat these things.
Well, I'm repeating what
Wait a
she
minute, we're gonna
said.
have a
I'd like
discussion
to-
period.
I shot the interview.
Yeah.
Huh?
I shot the interview.
One of the interviews, it was
You must
funny.
make a presentation here. Put
Okay.
yourself on the schedule.
So on June 2nd, the troops attempted to enter the square. That was the first sending of troops in. And they were unarmed at that time. They were attacked, and there were military units that were by that time were functioning. I mean, they're paramilitary units. And then I want to just read a little from this article. In the days immediately following, after June 4th, 1989, the New York Times headlines, articles, and editorials used the figure that thousands of peaceful activists had been massacred when the army sent tanks and soldiers into the square. The number that the Times was using as an estimate of the dead was 2,600. That figure was used as the go-to number for student activists who were mowed down in Tiananmen Square. Almost every U.S. media outlet reported many thousands killed. Many media outlets said as many as 8,000 had been killed. Tim Russert, who was a big superstar then, as NBC's Washington bureau chief, appearing later on Meet the Press, said tens of thousands of people died in Tiananmen Square. And this was a fictionalized version. By the way, is someone keeping time?
You know, you
No,
probably
that's
have
okay.
about 5 minutes.
Okay, so it was a false narrative. Here's what Jay Matthews who was the Washington Post first bureau chief in Beijing, said in a 1998 article in the Columbia Journalism Review, "Most of the hundreds of journalists that night, including me, were in other parts of the city, were removed from the square so they could not witness the final chapter of the student's story. Those who tried to remain close filed dramatic accounts that in some cases buttressed the myth of a student massacre." But then he goes on to say, "The facts of Tiananmen have been known for a long time. When Clinton visited the square this June," this was Hillary Clinton, "both the Washington Post and New York Times explained that no one died there in the square during the 1989 crackdown." And so the Times reported this, and actually on the day after June 4th, on June 5th, let me say, I'll go to another part. On June 5th, the Washington Post got an article basically contradicting what they had reported the day before. 8 days after, on June 12, 1989, and I think this is quite important given his prominence in China, the New York Times published an exhaustive witness report of the Tiananmen Square, which was actually fabricated by Wen Wei-po. It was full of detailed accounts of brutality, mass murder, and heroic street battles. It recounted PLA machine gunners on the roof of Revolutionary Museum overlooking the square and students being mowed down in the square. This was picked up by media all over the United States. Although treated as gospel and irrefutable, it was a completely fabricated report. Nicholas Kristof, the next day, who had been in China, but not there either, but he said, he wrote, "The question of where the shootings occurred has significance because of the government's claim that no one was shot on Tiananmen Square. State television has even shown film of students marching peacefully away from the square. The central scene in the article, of the so-called eyewitness articles of troops beating and machine gunning unarmed students. There is no evidence of," this is Christoph, "there's no evidence of machine gun emplacements on the roof of the History Museum that were reported in the Wen Wei-po article. This reporter was directly north of the museum and saw no machine guns there. Other reporters and witnesses in the vicinity also failed to see them. The central theme of the Wen Wei-po article was that troops subsequently beat and machine gun students in the area around the monument and that a line of armored vehicles cut off the retreat. But the witnesses say that the armored vehicles did not surround the monument. They stayed at the north end, and the troops did not attack students clustered around the monument." In fact, and then it goes on to say that the students and a pop singer who we saw, Hu Dejian, were negotiating with the troops and decided to leave at dawn between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. The students all filed out together. Chinese television has shown scores of students leaving and of the apparently empty square as troops moved in as the students left. Okay. So there's more. People can read the article, The Massacre That Wasn't, on Liberation News. I urge people to read that. And there's more evidence. And in fact, many Chinese soldiers were killed. And this is a picture, and people can get a copy if they want to. But this is a photo that was taken the day after. And if you can't see it back there, these are burned out military vehicles.
That's it.
In the approach to Tiananmen Square. And there were lots of burned out. This isn't all of the burned out vehicles. But there are accounts in the Western media, including in the Wall Street Journal, of Chinese soldiers being lynched, being murdered themselves, their bodies left there in the streets. And it's hard to reconcile this one photo with the central thesis that this was a nonviolent, peaceful demonstration and then was confronted by machine guns and ended with a massacre. It's not true. So just to conclude, because my time is up, the issue of counter-revolution in China is not over with. I mean, people thought it was over with before. It wasn't over with at that time. The economic reforms that were inaugurated after the death of Mao opened the country to foreign investment. This development strategy was designed to rapidly overcome the legacy of poverty and underdevelopment by the import of foreign technology. In exchange, the Western corporations got mega profits. The post-Mao leadership of the Communist Party calculated that this strategy would benefit China by virtue of rapid technology transfer from the imperialist world to China, and indeed, China has made great economic strides. But in addition to the economic development, there has also developed a larger capitalist class inside of China, and a significant portion of that class and their children are being wooed by all types of institutions financed by the U.S. government, U.S. financial institutions, and U.S. academic centers. The Communist Party of China is also divided into pro-U.S. and pro-socialist factions or tendencies. So today, the U.S. government is applying ever greater military pressure on China. It is accelerating the struggle against China's rise by cementing new military and strategic alliances with other Asian countries. It is also hoping that with enough pressure, some in the Chinese leadership who favor abandoning North Korea will get the upper hand. If counter-revolution were to succeed in China, the consequences would be catastrophic for the Chinese people and for China. China would in all likelihood splinter as a nation, as happened to the former Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. We should remember Henry Kissinger's famous statement that the problem with China is it's too big. So we should look at it that way. One closing thing I would say is to go back to 1983 and the demonstration demanding that Hong Kong be, that Ireland be freed and Hong Kong be returned to China, is that it was a victory that Hong Kong was returned to China, but in that victory comes other issues, other problems. And the problem being that it's incorporating what had been a capitalist and imperialist colony now is incorporated into the body of China. So that's a contradiction. But we're glad Hong Kong's back to China, and China will never give it up. I agree with that. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly, absolutely.
I request y'all can criticize the hell out of me when my 15 minutes is up. Okay? I thought I was the one that got the sniveling about this, and I said, man, every channel I turn to, this is the 30th anniversary of the the massacre. I said, let me turn this channel. Oh, this is the 30th anniversary. I said, come on, let me go to PBS. Right? Oh, so it's clear the 1% has a line, and they was dogmatic in their execution. Why? Because they realized, very, very, very unnecessary. I mean, I'm sorry that I have to read this, but this is the opinion of the ruling class. And one of the things that's happening is their situation with China is coming to an end. They're realizing what they thought. They thought that China would collapse like the Soviet Union did. When that didn't happen, and now China is the #2 economy in the world, they want to change their tactics and their strategy and their whole approach. Thus, they're pushing this Tiananmen Square as a beginning of, undermining the moral authority of China as a nation. Okay. So I immediately thought, I said, wow, what do people think when they see all this chatter about Tiananmen Square today and didn't go through the experience, know nothing of the facts? Anti-communism short circuits rational thinking. I'm a child of the McCarthy period. My father was in the Communist Party, left around that time because he was, I can get into all that, but the point is, I saw from within a left-wing community of black people how the pressure of capitalism against communists, they didn't care whether you was a member or not, if you know anything about the McCarthy period, The fact of the matter is there was enormous pressure on the black community. Only community in America that would not talk to the FBI. Oh yeah, I remember. Child, I was a little kid, but I remember this. Better dead than red. Remember that?
Yeah.
See, that's American communism.
Yeah.
Should make you crazy.
Yeah.
It is useful to keep this in mind when we hear or see the reactionary propaganda emanating from the corporate media outlets of this world. Even their choice of words should be carefully scrutinized. In lockstep with the mouthpieces of the 1%, they have described the numerous deaths that took place on June 4th, 1989 in Tiananmen Square, or around Tiananmen Square, a, quote, massacre. I read the article that Brian Becker wrote, and I said to myself, I said, oh, come on. You know, this, I'm thinking, you know, you're thinking, you're skeptical. Oh, come on, this, we're playing with words here, what's going on? But, so I said, well, no, let's take this seriously. I actually looked up massacre. I looked up genocide. Two words, this is generally overused words in our lexicon, particularly in the liberal, the rad-lib, you know, communities. Just generally overused and misused. So, for instance, let me give you an example, okay? After General Suharto's coup in Indonesia, the capitalist press at that time called the savage murders of over 1 million members and supporters of the Indonesian Communist Party a mass killing, an anti-communist purge, sometimes a slaughter, but never a massacre. The word massacre is a loaded term that carries with it a certain emotional judgment. A massacre means that you kill people that are totally unarmed and are not fighting back or trying to escape, and they're just mowed down. Was this the situation in Tiananmen Square? I'm so happy that these brothers before me have already explained it was not. I was going to try to be a little more skeptical and say, was it? And then you be the judge. But if you familiarize yourself with the facts, I'm sorry, I'm not as sharp as I need to be, but here is another capitalist mouthpiece. This is called the Tiananmen Papers. And I read this, once again, Foreign Affairs, because I wanted to know, you know. Well, my old friend Fred Ferguson, who was also in the Bolshevik tendency with me, always pointed and said, look, G, the truth will out. That is, sooner or later, the facts will emerge as to what actually occurred. This is very, very useful, because this gives you a day-to-day discussion of the differences inside of the Communist Party, you know, of China, and it shows you. It's already been mentioned. We can be more specific, and I think we should be, but I have limited time, so I want to just give you a condensed version of the facts as I understand them. Following the Cultural Revolution, a democracy movement emerged on the mainland. People wrote theoretical contributions on the need for democratic rights in China, including criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party on something called the Democracy Wall. I read I'm sorry, I don't have the book to show you. It's called Crossroads Socialism. Very interesting about the history of this period. Actually, there's no democracy wall in the United States, and you better watch what you say, because as a former member of the Panthers, I remember COINTELPRO. That's what I remember their response to us being.
What's a democracy wall?
The democracy wall, literally, is a huge wall that you know, intellectuals, and I'm talking about organic working class intellectuals included, would write theses and theoretical documents about the need for democracy. This was done publicly. Did the government like it? Probably not. But it certainly was not something that no one was shocked for putting something up on Democracy Wall, okay? It's already been said, We're talking about understanding, lifting the understanding of the American people so that they stop being suckers for this word democracy. You know, it's so clear. Yes, there's a class understanding of democracy, which is there's proletarian democracy, that's what I call it, and there's capitalist democracy. But I think people need to say proletarian democracy exists in our union.